There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, their edges softened by routine. They slip into the rhythm of your days like a quiet guest, and it's only much later, when you look back, that you see them for what they were, the hinges upon which your entire world turned. For me, that moment wasn't a grand declaration or a thunderclap of realization. It was the soft weight of a blanket, the low hum of a refrigerator in a sleeping apartment, and the man on my couch, oblivious to the fact that with every quiet breath he took, he was systematically, gently, and terrifyingly dismantling the fortress I had built around my own heart. It was a Tuesday, or maybe a Thursday. The specific day had been lost to a procession of identical evenings, each one a delicate negotiation of space and silence. Liam was asleep, his long frame folded onto the worn cushions of my sofa, a place that was rapidly becoming more his than mine. I stood in the archway between the living room and the small hallway leading to my bedroom, a ghost in my own home. The only light came from the cool blue glow of the city filtering through the large window, casting the room in a palette of shadow and silver. It was my favorite kind of light, the kind I sought for my photographs, a light that didn't reveal everything, but suggested it. It rendered Liam's face in soft gradients, erasing the lines of exhaustion that had been carved around his eyes for weeks and smoothing the hard set of his jaw. In sleep, he looked younger, more vulnerable, the way he had when we were 20 and sharing a dorm room that always smelled faintly of stale pizza and his ridiculously expensive cologne. He had one arm thrown over his head, his other hand resting loosely on his chest, rising and falling with a rhythm so steady it felt like the anchor for the entire, tilting world. My job, in this strange new ritual of ours, was to cover him with the old quilt that lived on the back of my armchair. It was a simple act, one performed 1,000 times in 1,000 homes. A gesture of basic care. But for me, it was a pilgrimage. Every night, I would wait until his breathing deepened, until the last flicker of tension left his body, and I would approach the couch. My own heart would beat a frantic, traitorous rhythm against my ribs, a drumbeat of don't wake him, don't let him see. See what? I wasn't even sure myself. The hope? The terror? The 16 years of unspoken affection I had carefully curated and filed away like old negatives, too fragile to be exposed to the light. I would lift the quilt, its familiar weight a comfort in my hands, and let it unfurl over him. My fingers would brush the hair back from his forehead, a touch so light it was barely a sensation, more a question asked of the empty air. And then I would retreat, backing away into the shadows, my duty done. But tonight was different. As I stood there, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, a profound and aching loneliness settled over me. It was an old companion, this loneliness, but it felt sharper in his presence. It was the loneliness of proximity, the unique agony of being so close to what you desire and yet remaining worlds away. This ritual, this nightly dance of plausible deniability, had become both my sanctuary and my torture chamber. It allowed me to care for him in a way I'd always wanted to, but the boundaries were suffocating. The air was thick with everything we weren't saying. I was a photographer, a man who spent his life observing, framing the world, finding the story in the space between things. And the space between Liam and me was a novel, a tragedy, a prayer. It was everything. He stirred, a soft murmur escaping his lips, and my body went rigid. My own breathing hitched. He shifted, turning onto his side to face the back of the couch, pulling the quilt tighter around his shoulders. He was settling deeper, not waking. The tension drained from my muscles, leaving a familiar, hollow ache. I had spent more than half my life loving Liam from a distance, a safe, manageable distance. I had watched him fall in love, had my heart broken by proxy, and had learned to be the perfect friend, the stable, quiet presence in the whirlwind of his life. I was the keeper of his secrets, the port in his storms. But this storm was different. This time, he hadn't just docked in the harbor. He had dropped anchor in the middle of my living room, and I was beginning to feel that I would drown. I looked from his sleeping form to the open doorway of my bedroom, a dark rectangle of possibility and fear. For weeks, that door had been a symbol of the line I wouldn't cross. Tonight, for the first time, it felt less like a boundary and more like a wound. Our story began, as so many do, under the fluorescent lights and institutional beige of a college dormitory. I was an art student, armed with a vintage camera and a deep-seated introversion that I wore like a protective cloak. My roommate assignment sheet had a name on it, Liam Henderson. I remember seeing him for the first time on move-in day, a whirlwind of kinetic energy and easy smiles. He was hauling in a desktop computer that looked like it could launch a satellite, his t-shirt strained across broad shoulders, and he was already laughing with some guy he'd just met in the hallway. He was everything I was not: loud, effortlessly social, and radiating a kind of golden, unshakable confidence that seemed to bend the world to his will. My heart, with a prescience I wouldn't understand for years, sank and fluttered in the exact same moment. My first thought was, I will never survive this. My second thought, a quiet whisper that followed immediately, was, oh no. He saw me hovering in the doorway of our tiny, shared room, a deer caught in the headlights of his charisma. He dropped a box labeled Books, Do Not Bend, with a thud and wiped a hand on his jeans, striding toward me. His smile was genuine, wide, and completely disarming. You must be Alex, he'd said, his voice a warm baritone that filled the small space. I'm Liam. Looks like we're cellmates for the year. He stuck out his hand, and I took it, my own feeling small and clammy in his firm, dry grip. That was the first time I touched him. It felt like a current, a low-grade shock that traveled up my arm and settled somewhere deep in my chest. For him, it was a handshake. For me, it was the beginning of a long, elaborate, and entirely one-sided love story. Against all odds, we worked. His chaos and my quiet found a strange equilibrium. He would fill the room with the sound of his video games, the chatter of his friends, and the endless ringing of his phone, and I would carve out a space of silence for myself in the corner, sketching in my notebook or cleaning the lenses of my camera. He respected my need for quiet, and I, in turn, found a strange comfort in his noise. It was like living next to the ocean. After a while, the constant crash of the waves becomes a kind of silence, a background hum that lets you know you're not alone. He would burst into the room late at night, smelling of cold air and the cheap beer from the campus pub, and instead of being annoyed, I'd feel a quiet sense of relief. He was back. He was safe. He was fascinated by my photography. He didn't understand it, not in the way my art professors did, but he appreciated it with a sincerity that was far more valuable. He'd peer over my shoulder as I was editing, his chin sometimes brushing my temple, sending a jolt through my system that I had to pretend not to feel. How do you do that? He'd ask, pointing at the screen. How do you see that? It was just a boring old tree, but you made it look sad. He understood the emotion of it, the story I was trying to tell, even if he didn't know the technical terms. He became my most willing, if unwitting, subject. I have hundreds of photos of him from those years. Liam studying, his face illuminated by the glow of his monitor. Liam laughing, his head thrown back in pure, unadulterated joy. Liam sleeping, for even back then, he had a tendency to crash wherever he landed. These photos were my secret history, a visual diary of my affection. They were exercises in light and shadow, but really, they were exercises in devotion. He was, of course, completely and utterly straight. This was not a guess. It was an empirical fact, demonstrated by a steady and impressive parade of girlfriends. There was Jessica, then Emily, then Chloe, and finally, in our senior year, Sarah. He would tell me about his dates, his breakups, his romantic entanglements, all with the casual intimacy of a best friend who assumes you are on the same team. I would listen, offering what I hoped was sound, brotherly advice, while my insides twisted into complicated knots. I became an expert at emotional compartmentalization. There was Alex, the supportive best friend, the platonic confidant. And then there was the other Alex, the one who lived in the darkroom of my own mind, the one who ached with a love that was impossible and absurd. I kept that Alex under lock and key, convinced that if Liam ever caught a glimpse of him, our carefully constructed world would shatter. The friendship was too precious to risk. It was the load-bearing wall of my life. I would rather live with the ache of unrequited love than face the silence of his absence. After graduation, our lives diverged and then converged again. He went into software consulting, a job that sent him flying around the country, living out of sterile hotel rooms. I stayed in the city, building a small career as a freelance photographer, shooting portraits, weddings, and my own personal projects in the quiet hours of the night. We saw each other less, but the bond held. Our phone calls were long, meandering conversations that picked up exactly where the last one left off. When he was in town, my apartment was his home base, and his relationship with Sarah deepened. They moved in together, bought a ficus tree, and adopted a cat. They were on a track, a predictable and happy one. I was the best man at their hypothetical wedding, the cool, artistic godfather to their future children. I had accepted my role. I had made my peace with it. Or so I thought. The shift began with a phone call on a rainy Wednesday in October. I was in my darkroom, the scent of fixer sharp in the air, watching an image of a deserted city street slowly emerge in the developing tray. My phone, left on the counter outside, began to buzz. I almost ignored it, lost in the alchemical magic of the process. But something about the insistent rhythm of the vibration felt urgent. I wiped my hands, stepped out of the darkness, and squinted at the screen. It was Liam. I answered, expecting to hear his usual cheerful update or a complaint about a delayed flight. Instead, there was a silence, punctuated by a shaky breath. Alex, his voice was small, thin, stripped of its usual confident timbre. Liam? What's wrong? Where are you? I'm in my car. I'm just sitting in my car. He was parked somewhere. I could hear the rhythmic thwack-thwack of windshield wipers. It's over, he said, and the words were so quiet I almost missed them. Sarah and I. It's over. I felt a complicated, ugly thing in that moment. A surge of something that felt terrifyingly like hope, immediately smothered by a wave of guilt and a genuine pang of sympathy for my friend. I pushed the hope down, deep down, and focused on the part of me that was his friend. Oh, Liam, I'm so sorry. What happened? He didn't need to explain, not really. I had seen the cracks forming for months, even if he hadn't. The way he spoke about their future had shifted from we to a more theoretical one day. The calls to me had become more frequent, his voice often tinged with a weariness that had nothing to do with his job. They had simply, quietly, and irrevocably grown apart. Their shared path had diverged, and they had both walked too far down their separate roads to find their way back to each other. It was a quiet, civilized ending, which he said made it feel even worse. There was no one to blame, no dramatic fight to rail against. There was only a vast, empty space where their shared life used to be. Can I? He started, then hesitated. The vulnerability in his voice was a physical thing, a raw nerve. I don't want to go back to the apartment. Her sister is there, helping her pack. And I can't go to a hotel. I don't want to be alone. The unspoken question hung in the air between us. My door is open, I said, the words coming out before I had even fully formed the thought. Come here. Are you sure? I don't want to impose. Liam, I said, my voice firm, trying to project a calm I didn't feel. You are never an imposition. Just drive. He arrived an hour later, looking like a ship that had been battered by a storm. His clothes were rumpled, his hair was a mess, and his eyes, his usually bright, laughing eyes, were dull and lost. He was carrying a single duffel bag, as if he were just visiting for the weekend, but the weight in his posture told a different story. He looked like a refugee. He stepped inside, and the first thing he did was wrap his arms around me. It wasn't our usual quick, back-patting hug. He just sagged against me, his face buried in my shoulder, and for a long moment, he just stood there, holding on. I held him back, my heart a frantic, wild bird in my chest. I could feel the tremors running through his body. I was his friend. That was my role. I was his friend. I repeated it to myself like a mantra, a prayer to keep my own treacherous feelings at bay. Thanks, Alex, he mumbled into my shirt. Thank you. Always, I whispered to the top of his head. That was the night the ritual began. I set him up in the guest room, a small, spare space that mostly housed my overflow of photography books and equipment. But he didn't go in there. After a long, stilted conversation where he recounted the final, painful talk with Sarah, we put on a movie. An old action movie, something loud and mindless. He sat at one end of the couch, and I sat at the other, the 3 feet of cushion between us a chasm. Halfway through, his head started to nod. His exhaustion was a physical presence in the room. Eventually, he just gave in, slumping sideways, his head coming to rest on a throw pillow. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, my entire body humming with a nervous energy. The movie ended. The credits rolled. He didn't move. I didn't know what to do. Waking him felt cruel. He was finally at peace, escaped from the wreckage of his life for a few hours. So I stood up, retrieved the quilt from the armchair, and gently covered him. My fingers brushed his arm, and his skin was warm. He sighed in his sleep, a soft, contented sound that felt like a punch to my gut. I turned off the television, leaving the room in the familiar city glow, and retreated to my own bedroom, closing the door behind me. I lay in my bed, wide awake, listening to the sound of him breathing in my living room. The architecture of my life had fundamentally changed. Liam was no longer a visitor. He was a resident, and I had no idea how long his visa was for or what the terms of his stay were. All I knew was that he was here, and he was hurting, and I was the one he had come to. It was a terrifying and intoxicating privilege. The first night bled into the second, and then the third. Liam's duffel bag in the guest room remained mostly unpacked. He would leave in the mornings for work, his movements quiet and subdued, and he would return in the evenings, the hollow look in his eyes a little deeper. He was going through the motions of his life, but the engine had stalled. The apartment he had shared with Sarah was now a minefield of memories, and his own new, empty place felt, in his words, like a waiting room for a life that hasn't started yet, so he came to mind. My apartment, with its familiar clutter of books and camera parts, its worn furniture and the scent of coffee and developing chemicals, became his default setting. It was neutral ground. It was safe. The couch became his designated sleeping spot. He never explicitly said, "I am going to sleep on your couch tonight." It just happened. We would eat dinner, sometimes talking, sometimes in a comfortable silence, and then migrate to the living room. We'd put on a documentary, or a sports game, or just listen to music. And inevitably, like a tide pulling out, the energy would drain from him. The conversations would taper off, his responses becoming monosyllabic, until his head would loll against the cushions. The first few times, I felt a spike of anxiety, a feeling of being a bad host for letting him sleep there. I'd gently try to wake him. "Liam, hey, the guest bed is right there. You'll kill your back on this thing." He'd just wave a hand dismissively, his eyes still closed. "It's fine. Too tired to move. This is good." So I accepted it. I integrated it. This was the new shape of our evenings. Liam sleeps on the couch. Alex covers him with a blanket. Alex goes to bed alone. The repetition of the act should have made it mundane, but it did the opposite. Each night was a fresh tableau of my own quiet longing. The ritual became freighted with significance, a secret language I was speaking to myself. The act of covering him was an act of love, distilled into its purest, most deniable form. I could study the details of his sleeping face, the way a stray lock of hair fell across his brow, the slight parting of his lips. I could allow my fingers to linger for a fraction of a second too long on the fabric of the quilt as I tucked it around his shoulders. These were my stolen moments, my tiny, selfish acts of intimacy in a landscape of platonic friendship. My photography began to change. I had always been drawn to empty spaces, to the geometry of loneliness in urban landscapes. But now my focus shifted. I started taking portraits again, but they were different. I became obsessed with the way light fell on skin, the stories told by a person's hands, the unguarded expressions that flickered across a face when they thought no one was watching. I realized with a jolt, trying to capture the essence of what I saw in Liam when he was asleep. I was trying to photograph vulnerability. I was trying to photograph trust. One evening, about 3 weeks into this new arrangement, he broke the pattern. We were watching some nature documentary about deep-sea creatures, the narrator's voice a lulling drone. Liam, as usual, was fading fast. He shifted on the couch, groaning softly. "My God, your couch is a medieval torture device," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. I gave my standard reply. "I keep telling you, there's a perfectly good bed 10 feet away." He was quiet for a moment. I thought he'd fallen asleep. Then, he spoke, his voice clearer than I expected. Is the offer still good?" My heart did a slow, painful lurch. "Of course, Liam. It's a guest room. You're the guest." He pushed himself up slowly, moving like a man twice his age. "Thanks," he said, and shuffled down the short hallway. I heard the door to the guest room click shut. A profound and unexpected sense of loss washed over me. The living room felt cavernous, empty. The quilt on the armchair seemed to mock me. This was what I was supposed to want, wasn't it? For him to be comfortable, to use the space I'd offered? But the ritual, my secret, nightly observance, had been canceled. I felt adrift. I went to my own room, but the silence from the living room was louder than his breathing had ever been. The next night, he went straight to the guest room after dinner. And the night after that, the couch remained empty. I told myself this was progress. He was settling in, establishing a healthier routine. But I missed it. I missed the quiet responsibility of him, the knowledge that he was there, close, in a space that was mine. I missed the feeling of being his guardian, even in that small, symbolic way. The door to the guest room remained closed, a firm, unambiguous boundary. It was healthier. It was right. It was killing me. Then, about a week later, I woke up in the middle of the night. It was that dead hour, around 3 in the morning, when the city finally falls quiet. A strange sound had pulled me from sleep. A soft, rhythmic, distressed sound. I lay perfectly still, listening. It was coming from the guest room. He was having a nightmare. I could hear his muffled whimpers, a choked sob. My body moved before my brain could object. I slid out of bed and crept down the hallway, my bare feet silent on the wooden floor. I stood outside his door, my hand hovering over the knob. What was I supposed to do? Go in? Wake him? Pretend I hadn't heard? My role, I reminded myself, was his friend, his safe harbor, and his ship was taking on water. I turned the knob as slowly, as silently as I could, and pushed the door open a crack. In the sliver of city light that cut through the darkness, I could see his shape in the bed, tangled in the sheets, his body tense. He was muttering something, words I couldn't make out. "Liam," I whispered, my voice barely a breath. "Hey, Liam, you're okay." He jolted, and then his eyes flew open. He stared into the darkness, breathing hard, his chest heaving. He didn't seem to see me at first. He looked lost, terrified. "Alex," he finally rasped, his voice shaky. "Yeah, it's me. You were having a nightmare." He ran a hand over his face, the sound rough in the silence. "God, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't. I was just getting some water." It was a clumsy, obvious lie. He was quiet for a long time. I remained in the doorway, a sentinel of uncertainty. I could feel the cold of the floor seeping into my feet. I should leave. I should say goodnight and go back to my bed. But I couldn't. "Don't go," he said, his voice small, stripped of all its usual bravado. It was the plea of a child scared of the dark. It shattered me. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. I didn't go into the room. I just stood there, a dark shape in the doorway, until his breathing evened out, until the terror receded from the space between us. I didn't leave until I was sure he was asleep again. When I finally crept back to my own room, I left his door slightly ajar, just as he had left it. It was a new signal, a new clause in our unspoken contract. The next morning, neither of us mentioned it. But that night, when he went to bed, he didn't close the door all the way. He left it open, just a crack, an invitation, a question, a statement of need. And the ritual, in a new and far more intimate form, resumed. The open door became a permanent fixture of our nights. It was a subtle but profound shift in the architecture of our relationship. The solid wall between our sleeping spaces had been replaced by a permeable membrane. It was an admission of his vulnerability and a test of my restraint. Every night, I would lie in my own bed, acutely aware of the sliver of light from the hallway that connected my room to his. I could hear every sigh, every time he turned over. The sound of his quiet breathing was no longer across the apartment, muffled by a living room. It was just down the hall, a soft, constant presence. It was maddening. It was comforting. It was a form of exquisite torture. He stopped having nightmares, or at least I never heard him again. But the door remained open. It was a symbol of access, a physical manifestation of the trust he was placing in me. He was letting me into the most vulnerable part of his life, the unguarded hours of sleep. I, in turn, became the silent watcher, the keeper of the night. My own sleep became lighter, more attuned to his presence. I felt like a lighthouse keeper, my consciousness a slow, sweeping beam, constantly checking to make sure his light was still burning steadily. The couch, however, was not entirely retired. Some nights, exhaustion would claim him before he could make it to the guest room. He'd doze off during a movie, and I would find myself once again standing over his sleeping form, quilt in hand. But something had changed. The act no longer felt entirely secret, entirely stolen. The open door had given me a kind of permission. My touches became slightly more deliberate. I would let my hand rest on his shoulder for a full second, feeling the warmth of him through his shirt. I would smooth his hair back from his forehead without the frantic fear of being caught. These were still my private moments, but they felt less transgressive. They felt more like they were part of my job description. One particularly cold November night, the building's ancient heating system decided to give up the ghost. My apartment, usually cozy, took on a damp, penetrating chill. I had a small space heater, which I had put in Liam's room, insisting he take it. "You're the guest," I'd said, a familiar refrain. "And you're recovering from a breakup. You need to not get pneumonia. It's bad for morale." He had laughed, a real, genuine laugh, one of the first I'd heard in weeks. It was like seeing the sun after a long winter. That night, I was bundled under 2 duvets in my own room, still feeling the cold in my bones. I was reading, the small pool of light from my bedside lamp doing little to warm the space. Around midnight, I heard a soft creak from the hallway. I looked up. Liam was standing in my doorway, a silhouette against the dim light from the hall. He was wrapped in a blanket, looking like a very large, very miserable ghost. "I'm freezing," he said, his voice a low whisper. "That heater is putting up a brave fight, but it's losing the war." I smiled. "Yeah, welcome to my pre-war charm. It's mostly just pre-war." He didn't smile back. He just stood there, hugging the blanket tighter around himself. The silence stretched, and it was filled with something new. It wasn't the comfortable silence of our movie nights, or the tense silence of my nightly vigil. It was a fragile, searching silence. "Alex," he said, his voice barely audible. "Would it be weird if I—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. He was looking at the empty side of my queen-sized bed. My entire circulatory system came to a grinding halt. My brain, usually a whirlwind of overanalysis, went completely, terrifyingly blank. Every contingency plan I had ever made, every mental flowchart for navigating my feelings for him, combusted into ash. There was no protocol for this. This was uncharted territory, a map with a giant, terrifying sea monster drawn in the middle. He was asking to share my bed. My bed. The one place that had remained unequivocally solely mine. I should have said no. I should have offered him another blanket, my sweatshirt, anything. I should have protected the last and most important boundary. I should have protected myself. But the look on his face, the quiet, desperate plea in his eyes, the way he was shivering slightly in the cold, it bypassed all my carefully constructed defenses. My desire to protect him was, and had always been, stronger than my desire to protect myself. I heard a voice, which I vaguely recognized as my own, say, "No, it's not weird. Come on." I shifted over, creating a space for him. He moved slowly, hesitantly, as if he expected me to rescind the offer at any moment. He slipped under the covers, still wrapped in his own blanket, creating a cocoon of fabric between us. He lay on his back, rigid, staring at the ceiling. I lay on my back, equally rigid, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. The space between us, no more than a foot of mattress, felt like a high-voltage wire. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the cold air in the room. "Thanks," he whispered to the ceiling. "It's fine," I whispered back. We lay there in absolute silence for what felt like an eternity. I was hyper-aware of everything. The sound of my own heart, the scent of his shampoo, a mix of sandalwood and something clean, the subtle dip in the mattress from his weight. I was trying to breathe normally, to project an aura of casualness I was a million miles from feeling. This is just two friends, sharing a bed for warmth, I told myself. It's a classic trope. It's a blizzard, a broken-down car, a haunted hotel. It's plausible. It's deniable. Then he shifted. He turned onto his side, facing away from me. I released a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. Okay, this was manageable. His back was to me. There was a clear, defined line. But then he shifted again, a restless, unhappy movement. He sighed, a sound of deep, unresolved frustration. After another minute of silence, he spoke, his voice muffled by his pillow. "This is stupid." "What is?" I asked, my voice tight. "This," he gestured vaguely. "I'm still cold. And we're lying here like two planks of wood." He rolled onto his back again. And then, before I could process what was happening, he turned onto his other side. He was facing me. In the dim light, I could just make out the shape of his face, his eyes open and fixed on mine. "Look," he said, his voice low and steady, as if he were explaining a complex piece of code. "My body temperature runs at approximately 98.6 degrees. Your body temperature runs at approximately the same. Basic thermodynamics suggests that if we were to, reduce the amount of cold air between us, we would both be warmer." I was so stunned by the absurd formality of his explanation that a small, choked laugh escaped me. "Is that your professional diagnosis, Dr. Henderson?" He didn't laugh. He just kept looking at me. "I'm just saying. It would be more efficient." The word efficient hung in the air, so ludicrously, so wonderfully Liam. He was using logic and reason to propose something that felt like it was going to stop my heart. He was building a bridge of plausible deniability, one scientific principle at a time, and he was waiting for me to give him permission to cross it. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. That was all the confirmation he needed. He moved slowly, tentatively. He shuffled closer, the cocoon of his blanket merging with my duvets. And then, he reached out an arm and draped it over my waist. He pulled me slightly closer, until my back was flush against his chest. He adjusted his legs, his knees tucking in behind mine. He was spooning me. Liam Henderson was spooning me. He rested his chin on my shoulder, and his breath was warm against my neck. My entire body was a live wire. Every point of contact was a supernova of sensation. His arm around my waist, his chest against my back, his legs against mine, his breath on my skin. I was rigid, terrified that if I moved, if I even breathed, the spell would break. This had to be a dream. It was a scene I had played out in my head 1,000 times, in the deepest, most secret archives of my imagination. But this was real. The weight of his arm was real. The heat of his body was real. "Better," I managed to whisper, my voice hoarse. I felt him nod, his chin bumping against my shoulder. "Yeah," he murmured, his voice already thick with sleep. "Warmer." And just like that, he was asleep. Within minutes, his breathing deepened into a slow, steady rhythm. His body, which had been tense, relaxed against mine, his arm a heavy, comfortable weight. He was completely, trustingly, asleep. And I was wide awake, suspended in a state of sheer, unadulterated terror and bliss. He was using me for warmth. That's all it was. A human hot water bottle. A practical solution to a practical problem. It meant nothing. It meant everything. I lay there for hours, not moving a muscle, listening to him breathe. I was his harbor, his anchor, his furnace. I was whatever he needed me to be. And as the first, gray light of dawn began to creep into the room, I finally allowed my own body to relax. I let myself sink into his hold, into the impossible, undeniable reality of his arms around me. For the first time in a long time, I felt warm. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly, terrifyingly at home. The night we first shared my bed, born of a broken heater and a logical, desperate plea for warmth, was not a singular event. It was a precedent. The faulty heating was eventually fixed, the biting November chill receding from the apartment, but the new geography of our nights remained. The guest room door was now permanently, symbolically, closed. Its bed remained pristine, the photography books undisturbed. The couch was relegated back to its original function, a place for sitting, not sleeping. My bed had become our bed. It didn't happen with a conversation. There was no, "So, from now on, or are we going to keep doing this?" It happened with the quiet, inexorable logic of habit. The night after the cold, he had simply followed me to my room when it was time to sleep. He'd hesitated in the doorway, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, a silent question. I had answered it by simply pulling back the covers on his side of the bed. He had given me a small, grateful smile and climbed in. And that was that. The new ritual was established, as simple and as earth-shattering as that. Our nights took on a new, deeply intimate choreography. We would brush our teeth side by side at my small bathroom sink, our elbows occasionally bumping, a domesticity so casual it felt surreal. He would change in the bathroom, I would change in the bedroom, a tacit acknowledgement of a boundary we were not yet ready to name or cross. And then we would meet in the bed, two separate individuals converging in this shared space. The first few nights, we maintained a careful distance, two ships passing in a cotton-sheeted night, each of us keeping to our own side of the mattress. But the gravitational pull of proximity was too strong. He was the one who always initiated the contact. He was, I came to realize, a deeply physical person. He processed the world through touch, sought comfort in contact. He was like a cat, needing to knead and press against something solid to feel secure. And I, apparently, was that solid thing. It would start with a foot brushing against mine, then a hand, resting on the mattress between us. And then, inevitably, he would roll over, sighing as if surrendering to a force beyond his control, and pull me against him. The spooning became our default state. Sometimes I was the big spoon, my arm draped over his solid waist, my face buried in the warm, clean scent of his back. But more often than not, he was. He would gather me in, his arm a secure bar across my chest, his legs tangled with mine, and hold me as if he were protecting me from the world. The irony was so profound it was almost comical. Here he was, the one who was broken and adrift, and yet he was the one holding me, making me feel safe. I became a student of his sleep. I learned the subtle shifts in his breathing that signaled his descent from light dozing into a deep, dreamless state. I learned the way his hand, resting on my hip, would twitch occasionally. I learned that sometimes, in the dead of night, he would pull me even closer, a subconscious, reflexive action, as if he were checking to make sure I was still there. And I was always there. I would lie awake, my body thrumming with a quiet, constant hum of affection and disbelief, and I would just let him hold me. It was a form of nourishment I hadn't known I was starving for. During the day, we were friends. We were Alex and Liam, roommates by circumstance, buddies who watched movies and ordered too much takeout. We fell back into our old, easy rhythm. His laughter started to return, the genuine, full-throated laugh that crinkled the corners of his eyes. The haunted look was receding, replaced by his old, familiar light. He was healing. I was his sanctuary, his charging station, and I was happy to be it. But the nights were a different country, a place with its own laws, its own language of touch and silence. And the dissonance between our days and nights was starting to create a fracture line within me. My camera became my confessional. I couldn't speak my feelings, so I photographed them. I took a self-portrait. It was a close-up of my neck and shoulder, the light from the window catching the place where his chin would rest, where his breath would warm my skin. It was a photo of an empty space, but it was pregnant with the memory of his presence. It was a landscape of absence and intimacy. I developed it in the darkroom, and as the image bloomed to life in the chemical bath, I felt a profound sense of sadness. I was documenting a love that only existed in the dark, a love that might not even be love at all. It was comfort. It was convenience. It was thermodynamics. I was a fool for wanting it to be more. I was a fool for letting my hope develop, for fixing it in place. The tension, for me, was becoming unbearable. The nightly intimacy, followed by the platonic daytime reset, was giving me emotional whiplash. My body was being told one story, a story of closeness, of possession, of a shared life, while my brain was being told another, a story of friendship, of circumstance, of plausible deniability. I felt like I was living a double life in my own apartment. I would watch him across the dinner table, laughing at something on his phone, and I would think, tonight, this man will hold me while I sleep. And tomorrow, we will pretend that it doesn't mean a thing. The breaking point came on a Saturday. It was a lazy, gray afternoon. We had done nothing all day, just drifted around the apartment, reading, listening to music. There was a comfortable, lived-in silence between us. We were sitting on the couch, side by side, scrolling through our respective phones. Our shoulders were touching. Our thighs were pressed together. It was a casual, unremarkable proximity, the kind that had become our new normal. He showed me a funny video, and I leaned in to watch it, my head close to his. When it was over, I laughed and leaned back. But I didn't pull away completely. I let my head come to rest on his shoulder. It was a small gesture, a tiny escalation. I was testing the water. For a second, he tensed. I felt it, a subtle tightening of the muscle beneath my cheek. My heart plummeted. I've gone too far. I've broken the rules. I was about to pull away, to retreat back into my safe, platonic zone, when he relaxed. He didn't just relax, he settled. He leaned his own head against mine, a gentle, accepting pressure. We sat like that for a long time, the only sound the soft ticking of the clock on my bookshelf and the distant hum of traffic. My phone lay forgotten in my lap. The entire universe had shrunk to this single point of contact, my head on his shoulder, his on mine. The boundary between day and night, between friend and something else, was blurring, dissolving in the quiet of the afternoon. My heart was hammering, a frantic bird against my ribs. This is it, a voice in my head said. This is the moment. Say something. Do something. Don't let this pass. But I was a creature of observation, not action. I was a photographer, not a subject. I framed moments. I didn't create them. But Liam was a creator, a builder, an actor. He lifted his head slowly, and I lifted mine. We turned to face each other. The space between us was electric, thick with all the things we had been communicating without words for weeks. His eyes, his beautiful, expressive eyes, were dark with an emotion I couldn't read. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't pity. It was something deeper, something more serious. He looked at my mouth. It was a fleeting, almost imperceptible glance, but I saw it. And in that tiny movement, the entire world shifted on its axis. The air left my lungs. Alex, he whispered. His voice was rough, uncertain. I couldn't speak. I could only look at him, my own eyes wide with a terrifying, exhilarating hope. He didn't lean in. He didn't move. He just held my gaze, his own searching mind, asking for something. For permission. For a sign. And then he asked, the words so quiet they were almost lost in the stillness of the room. Would it be okay? It wasn't a full question. It was a fragment. A plea. Would it be okay if I? Would it be okay if we? Would it be okay if I shattered this perfect, fragile, agonizing thing we have built and tried to make it into something else? My carefully constructed fortress, the one he had been dismantling brick by brick for months, crumbled into dust. All the fear, all the years of self-denial, all the carefully rehearsed lines for this impossible scenario, they all vanished. There was only him, his face inches from mine, his eyes full of a terrifying, beautiful vulnerability. And there was me, with a choice. I could retreat. I could laugh it off, break the tension, and save the friendship. Or I could step into the ruins and see what could be built there. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. Instead, I closed the small distance between us. My lips met his. It wasn't a passionate, movie scene kiss. It was hesitant, It was tentative. It was soft. It was a question, and it was an answer. It was the taste of salt and hope. His lips were as soft as I had always imagined they would be. For a moment, he was perfectly still, as if in shock. And then he responded. He kissed me back. A soft, answering pressure. A hand came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. It was a gesture of such profound tenderness that it broke me. The kiss was not an explosion. It was a surrender. It was the final, quiet click of a lock I had been trying to pick for 16 years. It was the feeling of a photograph, finally, perfectly, coming into focus. It was everything. It was the end of one story, and in the breathless, terrifying, beautiful silence that followed, I could only pray it was the beginning of another. The morning after was a study in silence. A different kind of silence. Not the comfortable, lived-in silence of our lazy afternoons, nor the charged, intimate silence of our nights. This was a brittle, fragile thing, stretched thin and threatening to snap. The air in the apartment felt heavy, pressurized. I woke up first, as I always did. Liam was still asleep, his back to me, a continent of sheets separating us. We had not cuddled. After the kiss, a series of soft, questioning, and deeply chaste kisses, we had pulled apart and had simply looked at each other, our expressions a mirror of shock and wonder. We had gone to bed and lain on our respective sides of the mattress, not touching, the energy between us too volatile to risk contact. I slipped out of bed, my movements unnaturally quiet, and went to make coffee, the familiar ritual of flimsy anchor in a churning sea. I heard him stir, the creak of the bed springs loud in the quiet apartment. I braced myself. I didn't know what to expect. Would we talk about it? Would we pretend it didn't happen? Would we laugh? My hands were trembling slightly as I poured water into the coffee maker. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, not meeting my eyes. He was already dressed in the clothes from yesterday. He ran a hand through his already messy hair, a gesture I recognized as a nervous tic. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice directed at the floor. "Morning," I replied, my voice overly bright. "Coffee's almost ready." "I can't," he said, still not looking at me. "I've got to. I have a thing." An early thing. It was such a transparently false excuse that it was almost insulting. Liam did not do early things on Sundays. Oh, okay, my heart, which had been tentatively floating, sank like a stone. I turned to face him, leaning back against the counter, trying to read his expression, but he kept his face averted, focused on lacing up his shoes as if it were the most complicated task in the world. He was a fortress of avoidance. The open, vulnerable man from yesterday afternoon, the one who had asked for permission to kiss me, was gone. In his place was a stranger, a tense, coiled spring of anxiety. He grabbed his keys from the bowl by the door. I'll text you," he said, his hand on the doorknob. He finally, briefly, flicked his eyes toward me, and in them, I saw a flash of panic, of pure, unadulterated fear. And then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, and the deadbolt turned with a final, metallic thud, a sound of absolute finality. I stood in the kitchen for a long time, the smell of brewing coffee filling the air, a scent that suddenly felt mocking. The silence he left behind was a physical presence. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air, all the hope, out of the room. I walked into the living room. The indentations of where we had sat on the couch were still visible. I touched the spot, the fabric still holding a phantom warmth. I felt like a fool. A naive, hopeful idiot. I had misinterpreted everything. The need for comfort, the desire for warmth, the loneliness. I had taken all of it and twisted it into a shape that fit my own secret desires. He had been confused, grieving, and I had been a convenient, warm body. The kiss had been a moment of madness, a miscalculation, an experiment he now deeply regretted. The next few days were a special kind of hell. His text, when it finally came, was a masterpiece of non-committal brevity. "Hey, crazy week at work. Hope you're good." It was a text you send to an acquaintance, not the man you had been sharing a bed with for weeks, the man you had kissed. I tried to respond casually, to play his game. "No worries. All good here. Let me know when you're free." The response was a single, solitary thumbs up emoji. It felt like a slap in the face. He didn't come back to the apartment. His duffel bag was still in the guest room. His toothbrush was still in my bathroom, but he was gone. The apartment, which had felt like a shared sanctuary, now felt like my own personal tomb. Every corner held a memory of him, a ghost of our shared intimacy. The couch where he slept, the doorway where he'd stood, asking to share my bed, the kitchen where we'd bumped elbows. The space beside me in bed was a cold, empty expanse that I couldn't bear. I started sleeping on the couch, the very couch where this whole agonizing ritual had begun, just to avoid the profound emptiness of my own room. My work became my only refuge. I threw myself into it with a desperate, frantic energy. I spent hours in my darkroom, the red safe light casting my world in a monochrome of anger and sorrow. The chemical smells were sharp, acrid, a fitting perfume for my mood. I printed the photos I had taken of him, the ones from college, the secret portraits of his sleeping form. I hung them up to dry, a gallery of my own stupidity. I was surrounding myself with my mistake, punishing myself with his image. He was a ghost in my apartment, and he was a ghost in my work. There was no escape. After 5 days of this agonizing silence, something in me snapped. I couldn't live in this limbo, this purgatory of the thumbs-up emoji. The uncertainty was eating me alive. I would rather have the brutal truth, the confirmation that I had ruined everything, than this suffocating ambiguity. I needed a clean wound, not this festering infection of hope and fear. I needed to develop the image, to fix it, no matter how ugly it turned out to be. I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over his name. Calling felt too confrontational. Texting was too easy to ignore. I put on my shoes, grabbed my keys, and walked out the door. I was going to his apartment, his new, sterile apartment that he had been avoiding. I was going to corner him. I was going to demand an explanation. Not for the kiss, but for the friendship. I had to know if I had lost that, too. That was the real terror, the real loss I couldn't bear. The drive to his place was a blur. I rehearsed speeches in my head, swinging wildly between anger, pleading, and a cold, detached demand for facts. By the time I was standing outside his door, I had no idea what I was going to say. I just knew I had to see him. I took a deep breath and knocked. I heard movement inside, a shuffling sound. The door opened a crack, held by a security chain. He peered out, and when he saw it was me, his face went pale. He looked awful. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he hadn't shaved. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Alex," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "What are you doing here?" "Let me in, Liam," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. He hesitated, his eyes darting nervously behind him, as if he were hiding someone. The thought, ugly and sharp, pierced me. Was he with someone else? Had this all been a game? He seemed to read my mind, or at least my expression. He sighed, a sound of utter defeat, and closed the door to unlatch the chain. He opened it wide and stepped back, letting me in. The apartment was a disaster. Takeout containers were piled on the counter. Clothes were strewn over the few pieces of furniture, and boxes from his move were still stacked against the walls, unopened. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a crash site. "I know. It's a mess," he said, running a hand through his hair again. "I haven't really unpacked. I didn't care about the mess." I turned to face him. He wouldn't meet my gaze. He was staring at a spot on the wall over my shoulder, his jaw tight. "Just talk to me," I said, my voice low. "That's all I'm asking. Forget the kiss. Forget everything. Just tell me why you disappeared. If our friendship is over, just have the decency to say it to my face." The word friendship seemed to land like a physical blow. He flinched. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. "Don't say that," he whispered. "Don't even joke about that." "I'm not joking, Liam. What else am I supposed to think? You ran. You bolted out of my apartment like it was on fire, and then you sent me a thumbs up. A thumbs up. After everything. After months of you sleeping in my home, in my bed. You don't get to do that. You don't get to use me as your personal crisis center, and then just ghost me when things get complicated. The anger I had been suppressing was finally boiling over, hot and cleansing. "I know," he said, his voice cracking. I know. I'm a coward. I'm an idiot. He sank down onto one of the unopened boxes, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders started to shake. He was crying. Not just a few tears, but deep, ragged, heartbroken sobs. The anger vanished, replaced by that old, familiar, and utterly overwhelming instinct to comfort him. I crossed the room and sat on the floor in front of him, my knees almost touching his. I didn't touch him. I just waited. After a long time, his sobs subsided into shuddering breaths. He lifted his head, his face a mess of tears and self-loathing. I'm sorry, he choked out. Alex, I am so sorry. Just tell me why, I said softly. He took a shaky breath. Because I was scared, he said, looking at his hands, which were twisted together in his lap. When you kissed me. No, when I asked you. When we kissed, it felt. He shook his head, struggling for the word. It felt right. It felt more right than anything with Sarah ever did. It felt like coming home. And that terrified me. He looked up at me, his eyes pleading for me to understand. All my life, I've had this map, you know? A map of how my life was supposed to go. College, job, girlfriend, wife, house, kids. It was all laid out. I was following the map. And I was miserable. I was so lonely, Alex. Even when I was with Sarah, I was lonely. The only time I didn't feel lonely was when I was with you. He paused, taking another ragged breath. When I started staying at your place, it was just easy. It was safe. You were safe. And when we started sharing the bed, I told myself it was for warmth. It was practical, but it wasn't. I just wanted to be near you. I needed to be. And I didn't let myself ask why. I just took it. I just took what you were giving me because I was selfish and broken and I needed it. And then that afternoon, he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, we were sitting on the couch, and you put your head on my shoulder, and it was like a dam broke. All this stuff I had been feeling, all this confusion, it was too much. And I looked at you, and all I could think was, I want to kiss him. I have to kiss him. And in that second, my whole map, my whole life, it just went up in smoke. And I thought, what am I? Who am I? I've never felt that for a guy. Ever. And it was for you. My best friend. The one person I can't lose. So you ran. I finished for him, the pieces clicking into place. It wasn't about me. It was about him. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself. I ran, he confirmed, his voice thick with shame. I woke up the next morning, and I looked at you, and all I could feel was panic. I had broken the most important rule. I had crossed a line, and I was terrified I had ruined you, ruined us. I thought if I could just put some distance between us, I could shove it all back in the box. I could go back to being straight Liam, your buddy. I could pretend it never happened. But I can't. These last 5 days have been the worst of my life. Because the only thing worse than the panic of kissing you is the misery of not being with you. He looked at me, his face stripped bare, all his defenses gone. There was no plausible deniability left. There was only the raw, terrifying, beautiful truth. I think, he said, his voice barely a whisper, I think I'm in love with you, Alex. And I have no idea what to do. The confession, when it came, didn't land like a victory. It landed like a prayer. It was the sound of a man who had been lost in the wilderness for his entire life, finally admitting he didn't know the way home. I looked at him, truly looked at him, sitting on a cardboard box in his empty, broken apartment, and the last vestiges of my anger, my hurt, my fear, simply evaporated. All that was left was the thing that had been there all along, for 16 years, patient and steadfast. All that was left was love. I reached out and took his hands. They were cold and trembling. I held them in my own. You don't have to know what to do, I said, my voice steady. Neither of us do. The map is gone, Liam. We're in a new country. We'll just have to draw a new one. Together. A single tear rolled down his cheek, but this time, it wasn't a tear of sorrow or fear. It was a tear of relief. He squeezed my hands, a desperate, grateful pressure. Okay, he whispered. Okay. We didn't kiss again. We didn't need to. The moment was too fragile, too sacred for anything but the simple, profound connection of our hands. We just sat there for a long time, on the floor of his messy apartment, holding on to each other. Two lost explorers who had finally, miraculously, found each other on an unmarked map. The silence that settled around us was a new kind of silence. It was the silence of beginnings. It was the silence of coming home. We began to heal in the quiet. There were no grand romantic gestures, no dramatic declarations. Our new beginning was built not on a crescendo, but on a return to a softer, more honest rhythm. That evening, I helped him. I didn't suggest it. I just stood up, pulled a box cutter from my pocket, a tool of my trade, always on hand, and sliced open the packing tape on the box he had been sitting on. "Let's find your coffee mugs," I said. He looked at me, a flicker of his old, easy smile returning to his tired face, and he nodded. We spent the next few hours unpacking his life, transforming the crash site into something that resembled a home. We put books on shelves, hung his few pieces of art, and assembled a cheap IKEA table. We worked together, a comfortable, synergistic team, our movements fluid, our conversation sparse but meaningful. We were building something, literally and metaphorically. When it was late, and the apartment was starting to look like a place someone could actually live, a new, gentle anxiety settled between us. The question of the night: where would we sleep? Would he stay here, in his newly ordered space? Would I go back to my empty apartment? He voiced the question, his tone tentative. "You don't have to. I mean, I can handle it from here." I looked at him, then at the sterile, unfamiliar bedroom. I thought of my own apartment, the couch, the bed, the entire landscape of our recent history. "Your bed is new," I said. "It probably smells like plastic. My sheets are clean. And my coffee is better." It wasn't a plea. It was a simple statement of fact, an invitation. He smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached his eyes. "Your coffee is significantly better." We went back to my place. His duffel bag was still in the guest room, a relic from a past era. He walked in, went straight to the guest room, and emerged a moment later with the bag and his toothbrush. He put them in my bedroom, on his side of the bed. The gesture was quiet, but it was a declaration. The guest room was officially retired. His place was here, with me. That night, when we got into bed, the awkwardness was gone. The fear had receded. He turned to me, his expression open and clear. He didn't say anything. He just reached for me. I met him halfway. He wrapped his arms around me, and I buried my face in his chest, breathing in his familiar scent. It felt different. The desperation was gone, replaced by a profound sense of peace. His hold was not the grasp of a drowning man clinging to a raft. It was the steady, secure embrace of a man holding what was his. I was no longer just a source of warmth, a convenience, a safe harbor. I was his harbor. Our days and nights slowly, beautifully, merged into a single, cohesive story. The dissonance was gone. The man who held me at night was the same man I drank coffee with in the morning. The casual touches of the day, a hand on my back as he passed behind me in the kitchen, his knee pressed against mine under the table, were no longer fraught with subtext and fear. They were just the simple, physical language of our love. He learned the quiet ways I showed affection, and I learned to accept his more open, physical expressions of it. He was the ocean, and I was the shore, and we had finally learned the rhythm of our own tide. He still had moments of fear, of uncertainty. This was a new world for him, and he was learning a new language for his own heart. Sometimes I would find him staring into space, a worried frown on his face. I learned not to push, but to simply be present. I would bring him a cup of tea, or rest my hand on his shoulder, a silent message. "I'm here. We're okay." And he would look at me, and the frown would soften, and he would take my hand. He was brave, braver than he knew. He had chosen to discard his old map and venture into the unknown, all for the possibility of a home he hadn't known he was looking for. One afternoon, a few weeks later, I was in my darkroom, working on a new series. It was a series of portraits of him, not the secret, stolen shots of his sleep, but open, honest portraits. Liam, laughing, in the morning light of our kitchen. Liam, reading on the couch, his brow furrowed in concentration. Liam, looking directly into my lens, his eyes full of a soft, steady love. He came to the door, a silhouette against the bright light of the apartment. He didn't like the darkroom. The chemical smell gave him a headache, but he stood in the doorway. "What are you working on?" he asked. "Come see," I said. He hesitated, then stepped into the dim, red-lit world. I had a print in the final wash, a close-up of his face, the one where he was looking at me. I clipped it up to dry. He stepped closer to look at it. He was silent for a long moment, studying his own face, illuminated by the safe light. "You make me look," he started, then trailed off. "Look like what?" I asked, standing beside him. "Like I know what I'm doing," he said, his voice soft with wonder. "Like I'm not scared." I reached out and took his hand, our fingers lacing together in the dim, red light. "That's because you're not," I said. "Not anymore. You're the bravest person I know." He turned to me, and in the strange, monochrome world of my darkroom, his face was a landscape of perfect clarity. He leaned in and kissed me. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of deep, settled peace. It was a kiss that tasted like home. It was a kiss that needed no plausible deniability. It was just a kiss, and it was ours. We never really defined what we were, not with labels. We didn't need to. We were Alex and Liam. We were the men who lived in the apartment with the good coffee and the worn-out couch. We were the quiet photographer and the loud software consultant who had found a shared silence. We had built our own room, not with walls and a door, but with trust and a hard-won honesty. And in the beautiful, quiet, and intentional space we had created, we were, finally, safe. We were, finally, home. We had learned that the most important journeys are the ones that lead you not to a new place, but to a new understanding of where you have been all along. And the best maps are not the ones that are given to you, but the ones you draw yourself, together, in the dark.